we tend to think that it's a fairly new thing. It really isn't. I mean, I was in the library just before I came here, and when you go through the weekly review newspapers of, a few years ago, you'll tend to see that this is something that has been there. So in many ways, it's a fairly structural problem with the police. But for the purposes of recent history, I just want to throw around some few facts because ours is headlined as Facts and Figures on Police Violence. Last year, the World Internal Security and Police Index ranked Kenya as the third worst police service in the world. Kenyan police was only better than DRC and the Nigerian police. Between August last year and October last year, the Kenya police, at least cases that have been confirmed, they've killed around 78 people. As far as some of the facts and figures are concerned also, one of the things that is clearly emerging now, urban youth in urban poor belts, whether it's in Nairobi, Mathare, Kawangware, Kariobangi, the list goes on, or you are in Kisumu, places like Ubunga, Nyalenda, Manyata, young men between the ages of 17 and 33 years are at a much bigger risk of police violence. So what that demonstrates is that, yes, there is a fair degree of structural problems with the police in the way they kill, but the poor and young in urban areas tend to suffer more at the hands of the police. Wangui spoke about, some people are not fancy enough to appear in human rights reports, in police OBs, and newspaper reports. And that's for sure. And that is a function of really, a lot of the time, it's a combination of so many facts. One is the tremendous amount of trust deficit between the community and the police. The tremendous amount of cynicism between human rights groups and the communities. With respect to the police, a lot of the time, people tell you, why should I go and report to the police? The same police who have killed my brother. I have a case in Mathare of somebody who is now 32 years old, and he's told me, at least Abdullahi, over 80% of his friends, the ones that they used to play football together in Mtaani, they have either been killed by the police, they've either been killed by thugs, or they are in prisons. This guy is just 32 years old. And he asked me, and I asked him, my brother, how do you keep on going and doing the same job? He said, I can't afford not to do it because there are so many people who look up to me to be able to continue doing this. He's just 32, barely 32. And when we went to his place, he showed me the funeral cards for people who have been killed. So he says, all these people, they send me these cards because they think that, I'm somebody within the community. If I calm down and decide not to do anything about it, there are so many people who this will affect. I just want also to speak about, not really a transition, but a discontinuity with the way the police does their job now. Since Kenya's intervention in 2011, the language of policing was largely the language of counterterrorism. And it was largely concentrated in the counterterrorism triangle of the Kenyan coast, that is the southern part, the northeastern, and parts of Nairobi, that is around Isli and Pangani. But increasingly, I think the level or perhaps the intensity of counterterrorism operations that are being conducted by the anti-terror police unit has slightly changed in terms of the geography. Now you'll see it mostly in areas around Isiolo, Marsabit, and all the way up to Moyale area. The coast is slightly quiet now. So now what you see is police killing, young urban youth in the name of crime. Like Mutuma and Wangui spoke about the lack of data, we cannot really say that there has been an increased crime for the police to change in the way now they are going after the young men in some of these areas. So data about the police killings the police themselves do not keep good data. We had the human rights groups also, I think, we don't keep good data. And this is not, Game of Thrones of who has the better data than the other group. It's just the reality of, do we have the data when we are trying to make a case? When we say that police killings have spiked, what are the data that we have to make that call? A lot of the time, that data is not available. For the police, there is a precise reason why they do not keep the data, because they don't want to be seen to be killing, Even when a lot of the time, particularly around last election, the tension was between, oh no, yeah, we killed, but we didn't kill this number that human rights groups are claiming. At the very minimum, that is implicitly accepting that they do kill. But I think the purpose is not that. They don't keep good data. The human rights groups do not keep good data. So it becomes a very difficult thing. But at least human rights groups over the last few years have come together. We have what we believe to be a fairly comprehensive but yet tentative, because it's not, we're trying to clean it up and make it look good. And out of that data, what you see is there are spikes and troughs. And we cannot really account for this, except 2011, when we know that Kenya intervened in Somalia, and for that reason, we saw an increase in counterterrorism. So there is an opportunity to explore a lot of, to torture the data and be able to get enough out of that. I just want to wind up by speaking about, the intergenerational nature of the police violence in some of the informal settlement areas. Because big groups, organization that I work for, that is Amnesty International, human rights groups, and other professional groups, we really do not do a great job in terms of going into some of these informal settlement areas and be able to interact very well. But thankfully, last year, I think we came together. We had close to 8 community dialogues in informal settlement areas. It's not that we didn't know. Anecdotally, we knew that there is a pervasive structural violence targeting this group. But for me, at least, I can't speak for all the groups, the intergenerational nature of this violence really struck me. There was a grandmother who, at least, 4 or 5 of her kids were killed by the police. And according to some of our explanation, some of the killings took place even after they've surrendered, raising their arms, and she couldn't finish speaking. She just broke down, and it became very difficult to really sustain any conversation with her for obvious reasons. There are girls who are as young as 17 years old who've been married, and during last election, particularly around Mathare, who are killed. We have cases of mothers whose sons have been killed in Mathare. Yeah, the case of Silas Lebo, the 17-year-old boy who was killed inside his home. Like, the kid was just studying for KCSE that he was supposed to sit for in October. August, he was at home, he was just studying. They came, they beat him up, he was taken to the hospital, and he died. Finally, for me, at least, the heartbreaking part was, in this country, we are fairly socialized to believe that, education is one way through which you can rise through the social ladder. What really the last election showed is that, through 3 cases, one of Silas Lebo, another one Titus, who was a 4th-year student at Maseno University. He's done everything, he's finished. He was meant to graduate 15th December. He was shot in his neck and he died. There is a case of a young man in Ubunga. He was meant to sit for his KCPE just a few weeks before his KCPE results. 4 police officers came to his house, he ran away, and they beat him up, and they broke his right arm. That was the same arm he was meant to write his exam with. He couldn't write his exams, and I think he got 161 points, and he doesn't know what to do as of now. The headmaster took him to his place, stayed with him, because he stays very far from where he was, the examination center. The headmaster helped him to do his exam. But so stories like this are not an exception. It's stories that in most of these communities, they have lived with it. But I think for me, we need as a community to look at these problems in much more deeper way, rather than it being, you know, the police have killed people, we do what we generally do, release press statement, release reports, ask for the same asks that we asked from the same people. We tell the police to investigate. We tell the police those who are involved should step aside from the police force. We tell the police that this is unacceptable, this is the international standards, these are the human rights standards that the police ought to adhere to. I mean, we've got to ask, do we imagine that the police do not know that those are some of the things that they are supposed to be doing? They know. I think we need to find ways of changing the police calculus, as long as there is the entrenched impunity. The police officers wouldn't see any reason why they shouldn't kill. At some point, it felt like if you have been to most of these riots, it felt like it was a game. The police enjoyed. I mean, they derived certain level of pervasive sense of, you know, satisfaction from chasing the boys, and the boys, you know, throwing stones at the police. I think for me, we need a rethink in the way we do our police work, because facts alone are not enough. You know, we know that police kill, they know that police kill, police know that they kill. I think we need to find ways of changing the calculus and increasing the cost of, you know, on the police, that they cannot kill and get away with it. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot for this intervention that had me learn a lot of the situation here. My name is Guillaume Vadot. I'm a PhD student in Paris 1 University, and I had some experience in police violence that I will tell in my second communication. But for the moment, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of the forum for their invitation. So to the CHRIPS, to the French Institute for Research in Africa, and to Mathare Social Justice Center. If my pronunciation is not good, don't hesitate to have me repeat. I'll try to be understandable as much as possible. In this communication, I'll try to draw an overview of the evolution of the field of mobilizations and activism around the denunciation of police violences in France during the past 3 years. So yes, I had this presentation. So isolating this period of 3 years, so since the terrorist attack of the satiric journal Charlie Hebdo in the 7th of January 2015, and the massive Republican march that was held in the 11th of January with 1.5 million persons in demonstrators in Paris. Isolating this period should not obliterate that this sequence was nurtured by a set of elements in the previous years through the evolution of public policies, of public discourses on police, and also of specific social movements. But I shall try to give an account of this context in the first part of my intervention. But still there was something like an acceleration since 2015 in France, with the politicization and the extension of the debate on the item police violence in the public space, as well as in activism, and the appearance of what I will call new subjectivities, new convergences between actors, and perhaps also new divergences which have to be scrutinized too. So as a last introductory note, I would like to point out the necessity, and I think in comparison with the first intervention, it's much more necessary, So if we want to have good comparison, we have to keep in mind the volumes of police violence between Kenya and France. That is to say that even if the trend in contemporary France is that of a process of brutalization of the policing of specific spaces, like popular districts, some demonstration and some social movements, the data, when they exist, because we have the same problem, still notably differs from that of more authoritarian states. So 3 facts should be mentioned to give a rapid overview of the situation. Yeah, I think they are here. The first one is that if we had 155 demonstrations forbidden from November 2015 to April 2017 on behalf of the state of emergency, and at least 1,000 demonstrators were injured in Paris only during the social movement of spring 2016. I will talk a lot of this mobilization. There were no killed in street demonstration in France since 1962. So this is something that we have to have in mind. The victims of police intervention, like the killings, police killings, are to be found in France in the popular districts, particularly those shaped by post-colonial inheritance. Marie-Emmanuelle was explaining that in her introduction. So we have around 10 to 15 persons killed by the police each year in this kind of districts. And migrants trying to enter or to cross France are also more and more represented in these lethal interventions. And last but not least, a third fact, a review of police violence in France must point out that the specific policing of post-colonial popular districts has largely inspired the treatment of some social movements like squatting, mobilization in solidarity of migrants, or ecological occupation of land to block its transformation into infrastructures. So we have police violence on these specific social movements too. And in 2014, a young activist called Rémi Fraisse was killed in one of these occupations. So my first part, the next slide, is some elements of contextualization in the past 3 years in France. Because France was hit, and we had this very strong anti-terrorist discourse too, because France was hit by large-scale terrorist attacks, 2 times in 2015, and once again in July 2016. 233 people were killed in these attacks, to whom 9 other victims must be added through 16 other lower intercity attacks. This represents a strong escalation since, as a matter of comparison, terrorism had been responsible for only if we could say so, 8 deaths during the previous decade. French government response was firm and multidimensional. Perhaps the most visible and controverted measure was the implementation of emergency state, device provided by French constitution, and which enables, in special circumstances, it had been invented during Algerian anti-colonial war in 1955, to enlarge the policing power of administration out of judicial control. So prohibition of demonstrations, searches, house arrests, activists, as well as suspected Muslim French citizens were arrested in the house in this way. Emergency state was launched in the 13th of November 2015, and it was extended 6 times after, before entering entering common law in October 2017. So now it's a permanent regime in France. In addition, in January 2015, we saw the implementation of Opération Sentinelle operation, a vast deployment of French soldiers on the domestic soil. So we had 10,000 soldiers patrolling on the soil, and there are now 7,000. In the same time, a range of new laws and decisions were made concerning intelligence and supervision of the territory, the armament of policemen, and the definition of self-defense for the policemen too. It was extended. Apart from this legal provision, the political context was itself reshaped, the discourses, notably through what Fabien Jobard, a sociologist and specialist of police, called in a recent tribune the canonization of law enforcement institutions and the heroization of their members. So it's the next slide, I think, because yes, you see it's a demonstrator hugging a gendarme after the terrorist attacks. So these new public discourses had a lot of consequences in the framing of police violence in France. And what I would like to stress out here is that all of this impacted the opportunities and constraints weighing on social movements. Social movements were strongly impacted by all of this. In such a context, indeed, virtually every form of collective protest, every autonomous expression of street politics could be interpreted as defying this supposed national consensus. And reciprocally, the set of public policies implemented under the label War on Terrorism had numerous consequences on the social movements and were even interpreted as targeting specifically activist and collective action. It was intensely the case during the anti-COP21 climate summit, while the mobilization around this climate summit held in Paris in December 2015, that is to say in the weeks following the November attack. The demonstration, prepared for months by different coalitions, were cancelled and several activists were subjected to home arrest. On November 29th, around 3,000 people maintained their participation in what, from an ecological rally, became the first demonstration for the right to demonstrate in the center of Paris. So it was the previous one, I think so. You have, it's written on the pancarte, right to demonstrate. Paradoxically, it's not only this anti-COP21, COP21 mobilization. Paradoxically, the sequence I am talking about was also a sequence of re-emerging of social movements because of the low popularity of former government in France and a strong dissent with its politics. So in this way, the social movements were re-emerging in a period in which the constraints hanging on them was emerging too. So this is my second point. I come to my second point, taking this matricing role of a strong mobilization in France since the spring 2016, which played a strong role in rematricing anti-police violence mobilization. This decorrelation between the dominant narratives on war and terrorism and their implication on public order, as well as on the actor of public order maintenance, and the development of street mobilization knew its climax during spring 2016, when hundreds of thousands of people opposed the labor reform. Even if observing this 4 months long mobilization in detail exceeds the scope of this communication, I just would like to recall some facts about its contribution to the emergence of a new dissenting political subjectivity around police violences. The first element to point out is that the mobilization itself was defeated. Its principal demand, the withdrawal of the new labor law, was not listened by the government. And I believe this outcome is important to recall because the new political subjectivities I try here to identify are strongly linked to the general enclosure of perspective for such social demands. So in a way, you have a transfer from a social demand against this labor law to democratic demands against the impeachment on demonstration, the obstacles put to the expression of democratic social movements. Recomposing the chronology of the mobilization enables also a more accurate insight on the process of politicization which affected a large part of the participants. During the first demonstration day on March 9, 2016, the catchwords against emergency state were present but in far minority. Flooded amendments targeting the law, deprivation and precariousness. This situation evolved rapidly through the experiences of the mobilization, which was confronted to a very severe image of policing, regime of policing, sorry. On the second national day of demonstration on March 17, for example, demonstrators and students were hurt after the dislodgement from a university amphitheater in Paris, in my university, which images shocked on the social networks as an example of police brutality. So this was a repeated scene because on the second national day of mobilization, a high school student was pushed in the was hit in the face by 3 policemen, and the images became viral. So yeah, this kind of photographs they were viral in the here you have it's a policeman. He has no uniform, but he's a policeman in the first picture. So this kind of picture became viral and generated some kind of politicization around them. And then you had demonstrations that were impeached with searches of the demonstrators, etc., etc. So in a diversity of ways, this experience of repression shocked with the aspirations, but also the imaginaries of what a democratic social movement should be for its participants. The shock was discernible through the attention dedicated to police violence, especially at social networks, so that's these images, and a couple of alternative media with a large focus on this topic emerged at this moment. And it also echoed with a tribune published in the daily newspaper Libération, it's a newspaper, daily newspaper in France, denouncing the excessive use of force and the militarization of each demonstration. And this petition, this tribune, was seen by hundreds of intellectual artists, activists, etc. But among the forms of collective action in themselves, this shock crystallized in a peculiar grouping of demonstrators designed as a cortège de tête. So you can go to the, there's some photograph of this procession inside the procession inside the demonstration, which called itself the cortège de tête, which means head procession. So this was a grouping which grew over the weeks to gather 3,000 to 4,000 people on May 1st and 4,000 to 5,000 people on June 14th. In this new space inside the mobilization, the dominant narrative clearly was not anymore the one-target struggle against labor law, but the one against the world around this law, and among the latter, especially what was felt as a trend to authoritarianism in French institutions, expressed through the violent policing of demonstration. In addition to this translation from social to democratic demands, it should be underlined that the power relationship with public order enforcement institutions was central to the self-presentation of the participants in the cortège de tête, both in defensive, with people wearing tear gas protections, for instance, and in offensive ways, which means with voluntary confrontation with the public forces, like you see in the first picture. Medical teams were also organized by the participants in this pole of the mobilization, called street medics, and using a symbolic recalling that of war zone. And a coordination against repression, grouping lawyers and activists, was also set up in this space of this mobilization. Of course, such a range of practices were inspired from former experiences, like the Black Blocs, but also radical ecologist or migrant solidarity movements. Activists circulated from this later to the cortège de tête, and their abilities were central to its structuration as a political space. But the numbers here implicated and the inclusion of this cortège de tête, its practices and discourses inside the public controversy on emergency state make it specific. It is also in this particular pole of the demonstrations that was invented the slogan, "Everybody hates the police," which then became like a gathering symbolic point reused by other social movements. So that's why it was the title of my intervention. To finish with the matrixing role played by the 2016 labor law mobilization in the emergence of police violences as a new political cause, one element still must be added. The politicization I described did not only produce effects of unification and crystallization, it also produced strong dissensions. First, among the demonstrators themselves, with a strong controversy about the use of violence by participants of the head of the demonstration, publicly condemned by trade union leaders. Reciprocally, these later were criticized for their refusal to openly denounce police violence. Second type of dissension, with the formally constituted social space of mobilization against police killing and brutalities, which was deeply reconfigured. It means that there was a specific social movement against police violences before this mobilization, and so the extension of police violence as a political cause due to this mobilization shocked and produces frictions, tensions, exchanges with the formerly existent social movement. So here I come to my third point, taking another point of view from this existing social movement and its actors. When I talk about its actors, I mean it's a categorization made by another researcher who sees three types of actors, like families of victims and their support committees, committee organizing activists, collectives specifically organized on the principle of like representing the victims, the first concerned, collective of anti-authoritarian far-left activists, and human rights organization. So indeed, a field of activism of and mobilization around police violences did exist before the sequence studied here. Well, in this process of exchanges, convergence and divergences, I think that the case of Adama Traoré, which Almami Kanouté here present will surely add more detail tomorrow or today, I don't know. The case of Adama Traoré, a 24-years old young man who was killed during this year's arrest by 3 gendarmes. He was not charged and just run because he didn't have his identity card. This case holds, in my view, a specific catalyzing role. Adama was killed in July 19th, 2016. Namely, at a time when the mobilization against labor law was not over, and its legacy on thousands of people was still very hot. That is to say, his death, Adama Traoré's death, resounded in the mind of numerous participants in the movement as a continuity with their experience of police brutality. Reciprocally, this context of renewed attention for police violence in the media, in the left, in the universities, offered new opportunities for the activists who had been advocating on this cause for a long time, especially in popular districts irrigated by colonial legacies, which, it must be underlined, had not really entered the mobilization against labor law. This mobilization was more fueled by trade union activists, integrated workers, general high school and university students, and was strong essentially in big cities. This peculiar chronology thus enabled a set of convergences. The march, for instance, organized in the center of Paris by the committee The Truth for Adama on November 5, 2016, which gathered 5,000 persons, is a good example of this process. I had a photograph of this march, yes, for the numbers displaced, but also on overall for the ability to combine a strong mobilization of inhabitants of the city of Adama, Beaumont-sur-Oise, which is an hour and a half far from Paris, with the presence of a large sector of the activism evolving in Parisian militant arenas, which means it was a gathering of 2 different social subjects, around a range of social subjects. Other expressions of this crossing can be found in the series of meetings which combines the struggle against post-labor law mobilization, judiciary repression, and against police violence targeting the inhabitants of popular districts. Or in the 2 tribunes largely signed by intellectuals, artists, and political personalities, published in November 2016 and 2017 in support to the Traoré family. This process, but underlying only this first aspect would be simplification. This was interestingly, it would be simplification, to underline only this first aspect, because the process was also a process of reframing of divergences. This was interestingly illustrated by the revival around the organization of the March for Dignity and Against Racism in Paris, the 19th of March 2017, of a classical controversy, the revival of a classical controversy over the question of political representation of the victims of police violence. This march, held last year, was framed historically by the reference to the memorable march which in 1983 forced for the first time at this scale the eruption in the public space of the issue of the discrimination endured by post-colonial immigrants in France. And in 2017, it was organized among dozens of collectives by 2 main actors of the militant field here at stake: the Indigents of the Republic Party, a political organization claiming to represent post-colonial immigrants in the political field, and a collective called Urgence Notre Police Assassine, which means Emergency Our Police Kills, which gathers numerous families of victims of police killing. The assumed goal of the organizer of the march, already controversial in the previous years, was to develop through the demonstration a common representation beyond the large diversity of causes implying racial discrimination, and to struggle for its entrance in French legitimate political space. This project was subject to a renewed controversy between the primarily concerned actors themselves. First, and most significant, the Traoré family decided not to take part in the march, claiming that the priority was not to go to Paris and form a national representation to enter the old political arenas, but to build locally, and criticizing the poor mobilization of inhabitants of the concerned districts themselves by the march. which means that the terrorist family was saying, we have to mobilize in our cities, in our districts. The committee, Truth for Adama, was supported in its decision by a sensibility rooted in the post-1983 experience, when the eruption of the first march against racism fueled the creation of new political structures affiliated to the Socialist Party, then denounced as an operation of political exploitation. It also corresponded to the position of a generation of activists inspired by the theories of community organizing, favoring the local arenas. This controversy was entered by a range of collectives, and some other families also decided not to march. In the end, the 2017 march was a moment of relativization for its organizers, from the outside with the entry of new actors in the field, and from the inside with the reaffirmation of alternative goals and tactics in the struggle against discrimination and police violence. Yeah, this process, I think, can also be approached through what the sociology of social movement calls collective action repertoire, to describe the set of protests, tools, and action available to a specific social movement. Here, one can notice the enlargement of the repertoire mobilized by the actors like truth and justice committees, with the multiplication. It was true before 2016, but it accelerated then, with the multiplication of marches, campaigns, media interventions, meetings, etc., which means that collectives are a sector which was blocked in a more riotous way of expressing political dissent enters new ways of expression. And conversely, the cortège de tête, the procession in 2016 I mentioned above, took a strong inspiration from what Fabien Jobard and Jérémy Gauthier here present call the dissenting socialization of young male popular district inhabitants. So there were reciprocal inspiration. And last but not least, one could read the controversy of a March 19 demonstration also as a debate on the proper repertoire for collective action. I will now conclude. My aim with this communication was only to draw an introductory picture of how and by whom the issue of police violence is framed as a political cause today in France. My focus was on the social, my focus was on the social movements, but in conclusion, I would like to add another brushstroke, mentioning that the politicization of the issue of policing in France was also invested by law enforcement agents themselves. This picture is a picture of policemen demonstrating, denouncing the overuse of their forces, their poor working conditions, but also an alleged anti-cop hatred. Numerous policemen participated in a gathering on May 18, 2016, that is to say in the middle of the anti-labor law mobilization, and later in impressive night demonstrations after the aggression of 4 policemen in October 2016. The gendarmerie and the army also had their wave of contestation in the past months. And when I was quitting France to come here, several prisons were affected by a mobilization of their guards. It is thus important to keep in mind the complex interaction linking public policies, dominant political narratives, social movements, and street-level state agents. And in this case, the latter could also be approached through a focus on the emergence of new subjectivities shaped by the experience of the recent years. That means that this political discourse, public policies also shape new subjectivities, radical subjectivities inside the policemen. So thank you very much.